Welcome back. This is the Word for the Valley podcast. You've been listening to Pastor Mike teach in depth through the book of Matthew, and we've been making our way through the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Now, we want to recognize as we go through this genealogy that Jesus probably came from a family much like our own, a mixture of influences, witnessed good and bad examples, probably had to deal with dysfunction and mess and fallout. And so we want to know, how did that affect who Jesus was? What were some of his responses? And how does anyone overcome the natural influence of their own family? Well, let's listen in as Pastor Mike picks up in chapter 1, verse 6.
Obed then begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. David the king. In some ways, it brings us here kind of to the high point of the nation of Israel. Now, maybe not financially or materially, but kind of spiritually, it's zenith, it's pinnacle under David the king. David is the great picture, the greatest picture in some ways, of what Jesus will be and do when the millennial kingdom comes in, when Christ rules this earth with a rod of iron. Like, David is the greatest in some ways picture of all of that. Yet, it says there, David the king begot Solomon now by her who had been the wife, the fourth woman mentioned here, although her name isn't mentioned, by her who had been the wife of Uriah. I've done a few weddings. I've even done a few weddings of individuals through whatever reason, divorced, right? Try to work through the situation, rightfully divorced, right? And they're moving on. They're going to get married a couple years later. This happens. You would never have the goal when any of the paperwork, or certainly audibly, at that wedding ceremony, to introduce him or her as the spouse of somebody else when they're getting ready to marry this person. Yeah, by the way, she had been the wife of so-and-so, or he was the husband of so-and-so. Oh, what's his name? I forget. But let's just call him the wife of Uriah. This is what is picked out in this scene. To remember David. In the Jewish mind, sometimes they can have this ability to overlook certain things and miss the glaring errors of their ancestors, of their predecessors. As we can all do sometimes, especially if we want to paint them in a particular kind of light. There's all this debate, like, can we have statues of Confederate, soldiers? Or can we have statues of this? Or Thomas Jefferson? What do we do with somebody like Thomas Jefferson? Do you not understand that every single person in history has done good things and has done bad things? Do you not understand that they've all sinned to some degree? And that to have a statue or a memorial, we have Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a holiday. Do you think he was pious? Do you think he was righteous in everything that he did? Do you think he was sinless? Have you read anything about his life? Do you know what he did before he became the Martin Luther King Jr. that gets put out into the movies? No, but it doesn't matter. They don't have to be perfect because they're not Jesus. They are messed up. David, we don't have to view them as like a sinless, perfect. David was messed up. David the king, David the pinnacle, David the great, but he still goofs, and in some dramatic ways. This is later in David's life, the mention here of the wife of Uriah. He probably, most scholars believe, probably 45, 50, 55 years old, somewhere in there. And at a time when kings go out to war, he stayed back. He's starting to get older, so his soldiers were wanting him to be on the battlefield less. And he stays back and just happens to watch a woman showering on the roof of her house. There's a question whether or not that was reasonable, or did she have her curtains up and these kinds of things, whatever. But he sees her and he takes her. The remarkable thing in the account is, as you go through it, you're like, oh, this is an interesting kind of circumstance. This is an interesting coincidence that these things happened. David knew Bathsheba. Uriah had been one of his mighty men. I am of the opinion that David did their wedding. This is a man that stood with David and fought in wars with David. Even while David is sitting with his wife, this man is out on the battlefield putting his blood on the line for the nation and for David, and the nobility of him to this great degree. Meanwhile, David is back home when he should be out there with his army. He's back home sinning against the very men that are fighting for him. This is a sin of high degree, of intense betrayal. He takes Uriah's wife, and then in addition to that, rather than making it right when he had the opportunity, then he goes off and kills Uriah. For Uriah's nobility, he kills Uriah. So David is guilty of adultery and murder. Both of them, by the way, capital crimes in the nation of Israel. Both of them, reasonably, he could have been executed for, but God extended mercy to him anyway. Again, is this the genealogical line that you would want if you're the Messiah? Is this how you would want to be introduced to the world? What a mess his family was. Imagine, just briefly, don't do it too long. Imagine if we had a video here of 3, 4, 10, 15 generations back of the highlights of your family tree. How many of us would want to sit all the way through that? Right? And here God is putting this on display for the entire world. This is how he wants to be known. He comes from David, who had then begotten Solomon by the former wife of Uriah the Hittite. Well, Solomon then in verse 7 begot Rehoboam. Now Solomon, this great king, prosperous, but really on the back of David, right? Brought the kingdom to its power, to its wealth, right? But he also introduced idolatry into the nation, at which the nation never did really fully recover, and had 1,000 wives. There is no explanation for Solomon, right? What great wealth, great benefit, total disregard for everything that his dad was about. Right? He had learned, in some ways, everything he learned was the wrong stuff. And Solomon, him, right? No, Rehoboam then is going to give us a list of the kings that followed him. Rehoboam then became the king of Judah. It's interesting, it was under Rehoboam's rule that the nation divided. He's the king forever known as the one who split the Jewish nation in half. And he did it because he was arrogant and cruel and mean. Now, obviously, God had his will in it, and there was something the Lord was doing in the midst of that, right? But he's the one who messed it up and remembered that way forever. Here, Rehoboam. Now, the other kings. Rehoboam begot Abijah. Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat begot Joram, and Joram begot Uzziah. And when you go through the history there in the Kings and the Chronicles and all of these kings, you realize some of them were good and some of them were bad. None of them were perfect. Uzziah was a remarkably wonderful king in many ways, except then at the end of his life, he wanted to go and offer a sacrifice in the temple and contracted leprosy as his curse for it. Ends up dying as a leper. None of these kings are perfect. Uzziah begot Jotham. Jotham begot Ahaz. Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Good king, by and large, Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Awful king, by and large. Now, God extended his mercy to Manasseh at the end of his life. There's a great hope for repentance and change at the end of his life. But the bulk of his life was disastrous. And what it did to the nation of Israel, what it introduced, really brought them down. So again, in the middle here, there's some good things, there's some bad things, there's some high things, there's some low things. Even in the midst of some of their individual lives, they're good and they're bad. Then Manasseh begot Ammon, and Ammon begot Josiah. And Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers, and Josiah was a good king, and then his sons and all that kind of took over and followed him. It says here that his brothers, about the time that they were carried away to Babylon, they become the kings in charge when the city is, and Jerusalem is fully taken into captivity by the Babylonians. So again, good kings, bad kings, successes and failures, all of that measured here. Then in verse 12, now look, after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel, and Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. And we read about Zerubbabel, Ezra and Nehemiah. Zerubbabel's mentioned. He's mentioned in Haggai, I believe. So Zerubbabel is a name that we're semi-familiar with. Zerubbabel begot Abiud. Abiud begot Eliakim, and Eliakim begot Azor. Now, these are the Jewish people that came back from the Babylonian captivity, and they are just working to repopulate the land and basically kind of re-inhabit Israel, right? Some of the names are skipped. This is not a full genealogical record. The Jewish mind didn't care about that at all. They could skip generations and treat it as if it was just a father. And they would actually call them father, but sometimes it was a grandfather, a great-grandfather, or 10 great-grandfathers. It didn't matter as long as it was in the line. And so some of the names are missed, right? But he's just given us a recap, kind of getting us all the way down here to Joseph. But he has Zerubbabel. And then in verse 14, Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim. Achim begot Eliad. I'm going to read their names just because they're there. And Eliad begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Mathan. And Mathan begot Jacob. Now, it's interesting you do the work on this, and everybody has, obviously, Genesis 38, Genesis 4, they have the references, right? Samuel and Kings and David. And they can go down through, bam, bam, bam. And you get down here into like verses 13, 14, 15, and the commentaries just go blank. We have no record for who these people are. And then you're like, well, then why did God include them? There's no, what benefit are they to us? Except maybe to say that sometimes God comes through anonymous individuals as well. I think maybe in many ways, your family, my family, filled with just a lot of Joe Schmoes. Maybe not special in any significant ways at all. They lived their lives, they worked their jobs, they paid the things and did what they could, and kind of moving right along. And God's like, well, let's include some of them in the family too. We don't need them to be special. We don't need to even know who they are. We'll use them too. And then you get to Jacob. Begot Joseph now in verse 16, the husband of Mary. Now this is very interesting, right? Because it's going to say there in verse 16, of whom, it's feminine singular, referring to Mary. There is an allusion, even in this genealogical record, that Jesus is of a virgin birth. And we'll talk about it later when we get to it, that next section there in the end of chapter 1. But it acknowledges, even in the genealogy, that Joseph isn't Jesus' birth father. That Mary, the birth came through Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, when you take this genealogy and compare it to the one there in Luke chapter 3, you realize that they're not the same. It was the Jews for Judaism, by the way, that used that to stump me. That was my first attempt to witness to the Jews for Judaism. And I didn't realize they're like the Jehovah's Witnesses, man. They got a scorecard of things to make Christians look stupid, right? I mean, they just have you're going to have to get through some stuff and answer some questions to be able to bring Jesus to the Jews for Judaism. They got ammo that I didn't know existed. And I'm just getting started, and I go down to the little tent there. I was at Messiah College's campus. The Jews for Jesus were on campus in the conference. And so the Jews for Jesus were there. So then the Jews for Judaism parked their stuff outside of the campus. They weren't allowed to go onto campus to argue with the Jews for Jesus, because then it would have turned into a war, right? So Messiah says, you're not allowed, but they found a public place outside of the campus, and they parked their stuff in there and out, and they had the signs, and the Jews for Jesus conference going in and out, and the Jews for Judaism there basically saying, that's oxymoronic. You can't be a Jew for Jesus, is what they said. If you're Jewish, and that means that you don't follow Jesus because you recognize that Jesus cannot be the Jewish Messiah. But if you're for Jesus, then you're not Jewish. We just consider you to be dead to the Jewish nationality, the Jewish, by birth and heritage and all, and then go ahead and be for Jesus. But you can't be Jews for Jesus, is what they said. And I went down there, and I was 22, 23, and I had put a good 6 months in studying the Bible, and I thought I had answers. And I gone down there, I'm gonna give this a shot. I told Julie, hey, pray for me. I'm gonna go down there and witness to the Jews for Judaism. And the guy looked at me and he said, are you Jewish? I said, do I look Jewish? What are you talking about? I barely even know any Jews. You're like, I don't know. Not Jewish. Well, okay, you're a Christian then? Yes. He said, do you know that your New Testament has errors? I was like, I don't like where this is going. And I don't know. I don't think so. In my 6 months of study, I haven't come across any of those supposed errors. And he said, well, do you realize that the genealogies of Matthew chapter 1 in your Bibles, you call the New Testament, right? The genealogy of Matthew 1 and the genealogy of Luke, you realize they're not the same. One of them is wrong. he said. And I looked at him and said, I didn't even know there were two in the Bible. You got me on the premise. I didn't even get to the conclusion. What are you talking about? Two genealogies in the Bible, and I skip these things. My Bible reading, you get to Matthew 1, you're like, all right, let's get down to verse 18 and move on with the story kind of thing. I'm going to skip things. And then you get to Luke, and you're like, blah, 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 and move on, and they're like, I didn't even know that they weren't the same. Well, there's obviously a failure with your text. This can't be true, can't be right. They don't agree. Until you realize Matthew is giving us the legal genealogy. Now, he takes it through the supposed father as Joseph would have adopted Jesus as his own son and makes him of the legal line. It is remarkable. Many times through here, the firstborn son is not the one included in the genealogy, right? Esau traded away his stuff. Jacob got it by lying, deceiving, these kinds of things. There are a lot of exceptions in this genealogical line. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense. It seems like an exception, right? That Joseph would have adopted Jesus and that the legal line would come through an adoption in this kind of way. That doesn't make any sense. Most of this genealogy doesn't. So if that's your argument, then fine, right? I think you'll find if you read the Bible, most of it doesn't make sense until you put your faith in Jesus, and then somehow or another it makes sense. So that's just the way it goes. This is the legal line. When you get to the book of Luke, that genealogical record is taken through Jesus' bloodline. Jesus' bloodline comes through Mary. That is his biological genealogy. And they're for different reasons. Luke wants to present Jesus as the Son of Man. He wants to present Jesus as human. Right? Matthew wants to present Jesus as the fulfillment of the Jewish Messiah. Completely different purposes, and so therefore different genealogies. Now listen, I didn't learn that for years later. Right? So I can't go back to them and get to question number 2 with the Jews for Judaism. So that was a failure on my part. But listen, sometimes you fail and you learn a lot in so doing. So that's the way that it goes. This is the legal line of the messiahship of Jesus Christ coming through Joseph, even though he had no blood in Jesus at all. There's no DNA from Joseph included in this. You know that Jesus' earthly brothers didn't believe in him, actually ridiculed him for the majority of his life? Didn't even seem that they even came to faith in Jesus until maybe after Jesus had resurrected. All those years of arguing with Jesus and criticizing him, hey, go up to the feast, hey, do this, hey, do a miracle, hey, if you are and they were always doing this to Jesus. That's why he said to them, your time is always ready, my time is not yet. You're trying to always push this. Because they didn't believe in Jesus. I think it's John 9. They were trying to ridicule him. Maybe 7. It's in John. We'll find it later. And but they're always just kind of criticizing Jesus. Does he understand what it is to be the only one of faith in the entire family? Have a loving father who doesn't quite understand? A mother who treasures it all up in her hearts, but she has no answer to any of this stuff. Right? And then just generation after generation. Does Jesus understand? Does Jesus understand your family? Does Jesus understand your pain? Does Jesus understand your experience? Does Jesus know what it's like to be raised in a faithless home, in a divided home, in a broken home, in a dysfunctional home, in a sinning home? Does he understand? All of this is a part of his blood. All of this is a part of his life, his record, his what he's incarnating into. Does he understand? He fully understands. And in some ways, he's the only one who really does. Even you don't understand your life as much as he understands your life. He's the only one who really knows it. He's the only one who's really experienced all of it. We opt out of stuff. We opt out of pain. We opt out of experience. We take shortcuts. We use drugs or alcohol or relationships or sin. We use other things in our lives to shortcut pain, to avoid it, to ignore it. Jesus Christ experienced all of it and never cut it short. He experienced all of it to the full. and came out healthy on the other side. So much so that the book of Hebrews tells us that he was made like us in every way, yet without sin. Now that is a hard thing to imagine, right? A sinless 2-year-old, or a sinless 5-year-old, or a sinless 10-year-old, or a sinless 18-year-old, or a sinless 25-year-old. It's really hard to imagine a sinless 45-year-old, right? Hard to imagine. Jesus did this whole thing, always doing the right thing. Perfect. Now, he recaps it in verse 17 by saying all the generations. From Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the captivity in Babylon are 14 generations, and from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. Do not think that a great coincidence in some ways, 14, 14, 14. It's Matthew's methodology to make it 14, 14, 14, by whom he excludes a handful of names in the record. But it's a memorization tactic to be able to have things in groups of 14 or in groups in these kinds of ways that would help people to memorize. And so he's just writing it down, shortcutting it that way in 3 sets of 14. Now let me say this now, okay, as we wrap up. So we look at Jesus' family. I'm sure we can overlay certain individuals out of this line with individuals from our own family. The remarkable thing here is not so much that Jesus understands. That is a remarkable thing. If I was thinking, like, if I was going to come as God in human flesh, I would have found a better family. And then I almost felt like God was saying, this is the best family I could find. What do you mean a better family? There ain't better families. This is as good as it gets. And it's miserable, but it's still as good as it gets. Right? There are people in here that kill their own children in fires. Right? Sacrifice their own firstborn sons. I mean, it's all kinds of sin and dysfunction in this mess. It's almost like it's the best that God could find, maybe, or the worst, certainly representative in many ways. So it's probably not this big a deal if God was going to incarnate in human flesh that the family that he would come to be a part of would be dysfunctional. In some ways, every family is somewhat dysfunctional. Somewhere you got a skeleton in your closet, I know it. Right? What's remarkable is that he came into this family and he didn't contribute to the dysfunction. The dysfunction actually stops with Jesus here. It ends. So that what Jesus then contributes is not the perpetuation of the natural family, which is what so many of us end up doing. We end up either doing what we've seen, or we try to react to not do what we've seen, and in so doing, then we sin in the opposite direction. We overcompensate, we over-adjust on the other side. And because we don't want to be harsh like our dad was harsh. He was just mean. So then we're too passive and we let too much stuff go. Or we're harsh and don't want to be that way. The remarkable thing about Jesus is when he came, he was able to stop all that stuff. It tells us in the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, that when Jesus came, he did not come in the fulfillment of the fleshly commandment, but he came instead in the power of the endless life. Meaning that what Jesus brought to this genealogy and what Jesus brings to this world, the power of the endless life, the power of eternal life, what Jesus brings here is sufficient to overcome any natural influence that the family would bring. And there is no greater influence than the family. I don't care what you say. There is no greater influence in this world than the family. I've seen it over and over again in ministry and in society. You try to do this and you try to fix. There's no greater influence than the family, except the spiritual influence of Jesus Christ to born somebody anew and to make them a new creation. And now almost in some ways, boom, 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 you can just see it, right? You can see the sin passed down one generation to the other. See the dysfunction passed down. See, and now boom, boom. And now here we are. And we're like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that. And the Lord comes to us and says, listen, let me make you different. Why don't you track your line? Not through your natural birth. Why don't you track your line through your spiritual birth? Why don't you track your line through me? In some ways, I am appreciative of my parents, greatly, just my grandparents, appreciative in so many ways. Doesn't mean they're perfect. No parent is perfect. Every family's got their own dysfunctions in different weird ways, right? My family's so weird. Join the crowd. It's a universal statement. That's one of those things like, I'm a sinner. You just like, duh. We all are. Let's move on. Like, tell me something we didn't know. My family's odd. My family's weird. We all are. And every family is. Every family is. But that is not the end of the story. And in some ways, we need to see ourselves less. Mike Gogler, the son of Dennis and Karen. And more. Mike Gogler, the son of the Most High God. And that relationship trumps the other ones. That relationship overrides the other ones. Jesus, remember, he said with the communion last week, you have to hate these other relationships in comparison to loving me. That relationship with God, with Jesus, overrides these other things. And then, remarkably, you can be of some benefit to your family when you put it in the right order and you handle it in the right direction, as Jesus was for all of these people. Remarkably, Jesus was the substitutionary atonement for David, for Solomon, for Abraham, for Isaac. They were the sacrifice they were all looking forward to. And that we are looking back to, they found that in Jesus Christ. They found it in Jesus. He saved them. But he did not save them because they identified with them. That was necessary. But he saved them because he brought that into their family and then was something different. And the same has to be true for all of us. Right? If you're here this morning, you've not been born again, you're not a new creation, you are going to replicate what you know. You are going to do what you see. You are going to do what you experience. In some ways, you may be able to modify that. You might try to make it more socially acceptable. Right? I'm not going to live like my parents, but now I'm going to go get a job and I'm going to go Wall Street. I'm going to go make big money. But you just traded trailer park living for Wall Street living, and really the same gods are still there. You've just done it more socially acceptable. If you haven't been born again, you are going to be what you are. You're going to be what you've been given. But if you come to Jesus, you come to faith in Jesus Christ, he introduces a new source, a new input into your life where you don't have to be anything that you once were. You can be completely new. You can be made different. And this is the hope that we have, right? This is the message that we have. If our only hope in this world was to somehow or another that the government could give people more money to keep, keep them from working, basically, but keep them out of need, right? Cradle to grave welfare system. Like that's going to be the solution that's the solution that's being proposed to this goofy world. And we're just going to perpetuate the same things over and over again, and they're going to degenerate. They're not going to get better. Our message as the church, our message here for you guys, listen, you don't have to be that, be something different, but you have to put your faith in Jesus Christ and allow him to make you new. Because you need a different source. You need a different family. You need a different father. You need a different father. He's a good father.
Okay, so we learned that Jesus was made like us in every way, yet without sin. That he experienced the fullness of human life and came out healthy on the other side. Now, what Jesus provides and brings to this world is the power to overcome any influence of the natural family. He introduces a new source and a new input into our life, so we can be completely new and different. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for listening to the Word for the Valley podcast. So long, everyone.